We're almost at the end. Control flow allows you to write code that can take a different path based on conditions being met. This is a really powerful concept, and in this video, we're going to take a look at our last control flow construct, the switch statement. The switch statement is an extremely powerful construct, and we're going to spend a bit of time poking around because we use it in lots of different ways when building apps. There's also a bit more syntax than any of the other control flow constructs we've seen, so let's go slow. We start with the switch keyword. A switch statement considers a value so that you can compare it against several different matching patterns. After the switch keyword, we provide a value to consider. Then we start the body of the statement with braces. The body of a switch statement is made up of a bunch of different cases. Think of it this way. Let's say we had an if statement that had many clauses. Rather than have a lot of else if statements, each case in a switch statement represents a particular path for the code. To match against a case, we write the keyword case followed by the pattern that the value has to match. Following this, we place a colon and the code to be executed. So here we're saying that if the value that we're providing to consider matches the value or pattern in a case, then you're going to execute the code inside this case. We can repeat this as many times as we want for as many cases as we need. If none of the cases match, then we include a default case. The syntax for this is just like a case statement, except that we use the keyword default. Think of this as the same thing as an else clause in an if statement. Switch statements are really powerful, so much so that we're only going to look at a small subset of what it can do for now. We need to learn certain other things about Swift before we can fully use it, but let's start with a really simple example. We'll put a comment in here, we'll say switch statement. Now, if this playground is getting too large for you, feel free to split it up into different pages. I'm keeping it all in one place so you can scroll up and down and refer to them quite easily to compare and contrast. Earlier, when talking about collections, we built a dictionary that contained key value pairs for an airport code and the airport's full name. Let's use that example again. Let's say when we have a particular airport code, we want to print out which city it is. Now, to make this example easier, we're just going to take those airport codes and use it in an array for this simple example. So we'll say let airport codes equal, open the array, and we'll list those out. So that's LGA, LHR, CDG, HKG, and DXB. Now, what we want to do is say if the code is LGA, which is LaGuardia, we want to print out what city it's in, so New York City. If it's LHR, which is Heathrow, we want to print out London. We can do this with an if statement, but you'll see that as our conditions become more complex, the switch statement starts to shine. So how do we write a switch statement? We start with the switch keyword. The next thing we need is a value for the switch statement to consider. Now, in this example, we're going to use values from the array, but to start off, we'll keep it simple. We'll just write out a string. So we'll say LGA. Right, this is the value that we want to compare against a bunch of different cases. This is the value that we're considering, or as it's sometimes or more commonly referred to, this is the value that we're going to switch on. Now, we need to open the body of the switch statement, and then inside we'll provide cases to work with. Again, the way a switch statement works is that if it matches a particular case, which is a value or a pattern, it then executes a certain block of code. If none of the cases match, then it falls back to a default case. I like starting with the default case. Like the counter in the while loop, we get errors if we forget the default case, so let's add that first. So inside the body, type default followed by a colon. There's a sort of standard convention here followed by developers. Typically, if a case only consists of one line of code, we put it on the same line as that default or case keyword. If there's more than one line, we hit enter and indent the code, which our Xcode should automatically do for us. Since we're only executing one line of code, the print statement, I'm going to keep it on the same line. So if we hit the default case, which means that after looking at LGA and trying to match it against a bunch of different strings, and we haven't, then, well, we don't know which city the airport is in. So we'll say print, I don't know which city that airport is in. Something simple. All right, we have our default case, and as you can see, this is enough for the switch statement to work because at the bottom, it prints out, I don't know which city that airport is in. Now, let's make this a bit more robust and useful. Let's add individual cases. For our first case, we write the case keyword followed by the value that we want to match against. The first value we want to match against is LGA. So we'll say LGA over here. Next, we add a colon and then the statements we want to execute. So here we'll just print New York. Okay. You'll see immediately that the results area prints out the value New York, and so does the console. So what's going on? Now here is the value we're considering. So basically, let's say you have a value in your hands, the string LGA, and you want to know which city this LGA airport is in. So you have a table in front of you, and you go line by line. You say, okay, I have LGA. What's the first line in this table say? Well, if it's LGA, in the airport code section, then you look over to where the city is listed, which is New York. So, New York is the city. The switch statement works in much the same way. It takes a value to consider, which over here is the string LGA, and then it matches it up against a series of different values. So over here, for the sake of convenience, the first value is the exact match. Our case LGA matches the value that we're considering. And here we're saying, if this value we're considering matches this case, then execute this line of code. So let's add a few more cases to make it more clear. And much like this table of airport codes to city names, we're going to have different cases for each. So we'll say case LHR, print London. We'll indent these correctly. Then we'll say case CDG, print Paris. Case HKG, and we'll print Hong Kong. Now, the utility of this switch statement still isn't truly clear because our string is fixed to LGA. But you'll notice the moment I switch this to LHR, LHR is now the value we're considering. So we go into the table, so we have LHR that we're considering, and we say, okay, does it match LGA? Well, no, it doesn't. So we don't do anything in here. We skip to the next case. Okay, is LHR the value we're considering? Well, yes, it is. So this value matches this case, so now we print London, which should be reflected right at the bottom and in the results area. We learned earlier that a string, whether we type it out directly here or read it from a value or read it from a constant or from an array, is all the same thing to a program. So what we can do now, instead of LHR, the string directly, I'm going to take a value, the first value out of the airport codes array. So we'll say airport codes 0. Now nothing has changed here. This is simply whatever the first item is in the array, which is LGA. And you'll see that New York is printed out because we match on the first case. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense, right? You saw how it matched when we had a string hard-coded or written directly. We haven't really changed anything, except instead of typing out that string directly, we're getting it from the array. Again, this evaluates to the same thing. This string is LGA, so nothing has changed. Now, I want to give you a little behind-the-scenes explainer before we continue, because it's mostly interesting to see how this simple switch statement builds on everything that we've learned so far. Remember, we learned about type inference, right? Well, the compiler can figure out what type of a value this is automatically. That's because airport codes is an array of strings. Remember, if we option click on the name, you'll see that it is an array of strings. And when we retrieve a value from this array using an index, and we assign it to a constant or use it directly in the switch statement, then the compiler knows again that this is a string, because the array will always return a string. So when we pass this value to a switch statement, the compiler again knows that because this value is a string, the cases that we need to match against have to be strings as well. Give it a try, for example. By creating a case that is an integer, and we'll print integer, you should get an error. You'll see here that it says expression pattern of type int cannot match values of type string. The compiler knows this is a string and that this will never match. Now we also learned about the equality operator and how we can check if a string is equal. Essentially, what a case statement is doing is it's taking this value returned by reading from the array and checking using the equality operator if it matches any of these values given. If it returns true, then we execute the code that is associated with that case. If not, we jump to the next case and keep going until we eventually match. Pretty neat, right? Now, because we're grabbing the first value from the array every time, we're always going to match LGA and print New York, like we said before. Instead of hard coding this, let's use another concept we've learned. Let's use the for in loop to iterate over the entire array, and we'll pass each value to the switch statement. Now, that might be hard for you to figure out how we're going to do that, so just watch along. So instead of using this and hard coding a value here, what we're going to do is we're going to write out a for in loop. So we'll say for, and remember next we need to give a name to every value that we extract from the array. So we'll say for airport code in airport codes. By the way, it's convention to name your constant the singular version of your array name so that it's obvious to the reader of your code that this array contains many airport codes, and when we iterate over each one, we assign a single value to the airport code constant. Okay, so now in this loop, every time we go over the array, we grab each value one at a time and assign it to the airport code constant. Now the switch statement doesn't care about where this value comes from. All it cares about is that it has a value that it can compare against a bunch of different cases. So let's select all this, hit Command C to copy, get rid of it, and then inside the array, we'll paste it. Now it's still going to always print New York every single time as it iterates over the array, and that's because we're still reading the first value every single time. But we know from using a for loop earlier that every new value on every pass through the array is assigned to airport code. So what we can do is use that value in the switch statement. So now, as we go through the array every single time, this value is whatever is extracted from the array. So the switch statement takes each airport code to consider. So the first time around, airport code is LGA, and we pass it to the switch statement. So we're looking at LGA and we say, okay, does it match this? Yes, it does. So New York is printed. And then once everything is executed inside the body, which after each case is executed, for example, when we hit LGA, we print New York, we don't go through the rest of the case statement. It immediately jumps out. So at that point, we've executed all the code inside the for loop. So we go back to the next pass through the array. The next value is LHR that we've extracted. So this is LHR, and we pass it to the switch statement. So now the switch statement is considering LHR. Does it match LGA? No, it doesn't. So move on to the next one. Does it match LHR? Well, yes, it does. So let's print London, and we print London. Now, once we've executed the body of a case statement, remember, we jump out of the switch statement, and we're done with the for loop. So we go through the next pass, which is CDG, and we print Paris. We go on until we come to DXB. Now, when the for loop extracts DXB and puts it in the airport code and hands it to the switch statement to consider, we're going to look at the first case. Is it LGA? No, it's not. Is it LHR? No, it's not. Move on to the next one. Is it CDG? Well, no, it's not. And finally, is it HKG? No, it isn't. So once we've checked all our case statements and it doesn't match any, then we do whatever is in the default statement. We execute the code in the default statement. And that is why our final print statement is, I don't know which city that airport is in. So far, switch statements look oddly like an if-else statement, but with a lot more syntax. In the next video, we'll look at how we can use the switch statement for a more complex pattern matching with very little extra code.